Great. Hello and welcome to our special pop-up event and historic reckoning, Movement Leaders Respond. My name is Sarah Bradley, and this event has been organized by our team, the N&N Land Justice project, because the Vatican made a statement officially repudiating the Doctrine of Discovery last week. As the N&N Land Justice project, we work with religious communities, specifically sisters, to incorporate land justice into their property planning processes so that these decisions about land can become a source of both racial and ecological healing. Given the deep connection between land injustice and the Doctrine of Discovery, we wanted to hold space together to begin to unpack what this moment might mean. And we wanted to center the perspectives of Indigenous and Black movement leaders and partners. We are so grateful and honored to be with our guest speakers, Pat McCabe, Tila Troge, Michelle Shenandoah, and Saka Ivar. Many of you will likely recognize them from our previous events, and we'll be turning it over to them for a panel-style discussion in a few minutes. A few notes of housekeeping. Out of respect for our speakers, we ask that you remain on mute throughout the event. This event is only an hour, so we will not have time for an open Q&A. We invite our audience to give full attention and witness to our speakers and all they have to say. If you do have a burning question or an access need, you can send them to us in the chat at Amy. She'll be there for you, and we'll do our best to take care of them. At the end of the event, we'll share some concrete next steps you can take, and we'll also share those calls to action, the recording, and additional resources in a follow-up email. Before we get started with our speakers, we want to offer some quick framing on the Doctrine of Discovery. It's important to state at the top that the Doctrine of Discovery is an active legal doctrine and a global root cause of Indigenous genocide, land theft, and enslavement, including the transatlantic slave trade of Indigenous peoples in Africa. It is the foundation of colonialism, Western imperialism, and current US property law and land distribution. And this is something we see clearly in the fact that 98% of rural land and 95% of urban land is owned by white people and institutions. This doctrine has shaped our society's power structures, policies, customs, and mainstream worldview. So it is not only a legal doctrine, but a paradigm, a belief system and mindset. This paradigm is rooted in the false beliefs of Christian and white supremacy, as well as human dominion over the earth for the sake of private profit. Given all that, for many, this repudiation is something to celebrate, and for many others, it's something that raises eyebrows. It is paradoxically both significant and insignificant. In our view, whether it becomes truly significant depends on what happens next. Within the context of concrete acts of amends, reparations, and community healing, this can be a start. And given that the church is the largest private landowner in the world, and they just repudiated the foundation of a lot of that ownership, we hope this opens the way for profound healing, for material and spiritual repair work to be done by the church, including the return of land, the payment of reparations, accountability to boarding school survivors and descendants, and responding to the calls for truth-telling and solidarity with Black and Indigenous communities. To ground our audience with technical basics of the Doctrine of Discovery and what happened in the Vatican statement and didn't happen, we'll briefly turn to Sister Kristen Tomey and her knowledge of canon law or church law. It's important for Catholics, especially white Catholics, to take on the task of communicating and educating our communities about the Doctrine of Discovery and to take collective responsibility for its impacts. And so we thank Sister Kristen, a Dominican sister of Sinsinawa, for being a friend and ally in that work. Go ahead, Kristen.
Thank you. So I have the nearly impossible task of framing very quickly. But Sarah, I feel like you got us kicked off on a good note here. So, as Sarah mentioned, the doctrine of discovery is primarily a term that describes a principle or a philosophy that undergirded the whole scope of colonization over the past several centuries. Where it's associated with church teaching, and I'm assuming many of you already know this, is its connection in particular with 3 papal bulls. And papal bulls are letters written by the Pope to world leaders. The term doctrine is a bit confusing in Catholic circles because we use it quite differently when we're talking about church teaching. And so here, doctrine is referring really in a more broad way to the idea or the philosophy. So it's important to note that because these papal bulls are not considered official church teaching, and this is an important point upon which a lot of the language in this statement out of the Vatican reflects the language that it's not official church teaching. And so while the term doctrine of discovery is often used in sort of a one-on-one correlation to these 3 papal bulls that were written in the 15th century, it is broader than that. However, these papal bulls did have an undeniable impact, and not least of all, in furthering the philosophy of the doctrine of discovery with respect to the actions of the church in the colonization of primarily the Western world. The 3 bulls that are in question were written between 1452 and 1493. They are specifically referenced in the statement that we saw out of the Vatican last week. The first of them was written in the wake of the Crusades, and it is specifically addressed to Portugal. And it gives Portugal the permission to, quote, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. The language in the second bull, which is called Romanus Pontifex, written in 1455, grants Portugal permission to expand its territory, especially into Africa. And it uses the language of, quote, the land being justly and lawfully possessed, if claimed by Portugal. And it once again reiterates the legitimacy of enslaving people. The third papal bull, Inter Caetera, written in 1493, is addressed to missionary activity in the Americas. And in this bull, the Pope is writing to the leaders of Spain, giving them permission to claim, quote, all lands found and to be found, discovered and to be discovered. So we can see very clearly that even though not considered part of official church teaching, the language in these bulls had a profound impact on the activities of the colonizing powers in legitimizing slavery, legitimizing the displacement and genocide of Indigenous peoples in the Americas. The common themes, as Sarah said, that are found in these letters reflect an idea of discovery that equates with ownership, and that Christianity is a prerequisite for ownership of this land. It places Christianity and Europeans in a position of supremacy over Indigenous and Black people. And in these bulls, very importantly, missionary activity is tied to political conquest. Later, there was a bull written called Sublimis Dei in 1537. This one's important to note because it's often cited as a repudiation of the doctrine of discovery implicitly. This bull contains strong language urging the actually enslaving people and displacing them for their land is not legitimate. This is written after some period of activity in the Americas. So while this bull is often cited as an implicit repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, it's important to note that the words haven't matched the actions, right? The activity that was supported and legitimized by these previous papal bulls was already so far underway that it's arguable that Sublimis Dei had very little impact. So it's important to know this because as we read the statement that came out of the Vatican last week, there's a lot of language around the official teaching and whether the doctrine has already been repudiated. As a sister, my response is kind of two minds to the statement that we got from the Vatican. On the one hand, I'm heartened. It gives me hope. This is huge to hear this kind of word out of the Vatican. And on the other hand, I'm disappointed. The strong language, I think I would, if you feel like reading the statement, I would point you to paragraph 6 and 7 as the strongest paragraphs in the statement. But they're kind of padded by a lot of language that's quite honestly self-congratulatory at times and other times defensive. So as I turn it over to our speakers, I guess I would just encourage those of us who do identify as Catholic to ask ourselves the what's next question. Will we consider this statement as an implicit repudiation like Sublimis Dei or as an excuse, or are we going to see it as a call to action? I think we could view it as motivation for further steps towards healing and repair. And I'd like to leave you with the words of McCabe Black Elk, who's a leader in the field of truth and healing, who says that the actual work of reconciliation will not be in the Pope's hands or the Vatican's hands. We've been called upon as the body of Christ to take the steps necessary to face our history as a church and to seek right relationships with Indigenous people. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Kristen, for sharing that context. We'd like to now turn to our guest speakers, Pat, Michelle, Tila, and Saka. We want to thank you for being willing to discuss this, especially given that this topic is a source of profound grief. Know that we invite your realness, your power, the fullness of your response. And we'd like to ask each of you to briefly introduce who you are and your work, and then to answer two primary questions. What are the impacts of the Doctrine of Discovery on you and your community? And what does this repudiation mean or not mean for you and your community? And we'll invite Pat to start, followed by Michelle, Tila, and then Saka.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to speak and to gather here in this moment. So I'm from Diné Nation, and so I'll say ya te bene and she ya touch inishni aro ashi bashish chi ma adish gejni dashnale klaus chi dash she kwataus dan inishni. Yeah, I'm experiencing so many things wanting to rush forward. I'm hoping I can say something here. So my work, I would say, is the simplest way to describe it is, I was adopted into the Lakota spiritual way of life, and from there, I learned that it's wise to open your life up to the input of the larger community, which is all the life that's around us, sometimes represented by this sacred hoop of life, I call it, and that because we are so interconnected, interrelated, and Thich Nhat Hanh calls us interbeing, that we can't do anything without affecting each other. And our Western science is catching up with that understanding. And so, I was taught that it's wise to take time frequently to inquire from the rest of the community, what is the best use of my life? What is the best use of my will? How shall I move in a way that can be beneficial to everything and to really show the gratitude that I have for this life? So I've kind of created this word, it's the goal is to ask for the vision that can help me be that omnibeneficent being, like all my relatives are. All the life around me is contributing to omnibeneficence, not only the way that they benefit their own kind, but the way that they harmonize and benefit with their entire community. So my work is led by vision that way, listening to the spirit, listening to this Mother Earth, listening to the larger community, and then working to align my will with what I'm told in those ways. And it's been an extraordinary life. I will say in a short way that my work has been about proposing, about acknowledging that I come from extreme privilege, actually, which is the privilege is that I hold multiple understandings of how human beings have chosen to be a presence on this Mother Earth. I have my own people's understanding. I have been blessed by the Lakota Nation with the teaching. And then I've been thoroughly indoctrinated into modern world paradigm of understanding of how to be human here. And so my work is to say, notice that there's a choice. Notice that there is a choice of how to be that presence here. And different human beings have held it in different ways. And I feel that at this moment, modern world paradigm is searching, because they're finding that the modern world paradigm that for many, it's the only one that has ever been presented to them through academia, through the church, through government, through imposed economies and laws. That's the only representation and basis for being human being on this Mother Earth that they've ever been presented with for generations. And so I do acknowledge that I come from a place of privilege to say, it would appear that we have choices about how we're going to be that presence here, because I come from a people that go about it in a completely different way. So how has the doctrine of discovery impacted me and my people? My family history is that my grandparents and my parents were sent to Dutch Christian Reformed missionary residential boarding schools. And as has been said, but I'll go ahead and say it again here, the goal of those schools was to say, we want to make these people's understanding of how to be human being, how to touch the spirit, how to go about their lives. We want to make that way that they understood so repulsive to them that they will never return to it. That was the goal of the schools that my grandparents and parents went to. So the doctrine of discovery was the basis. I have relatives who are deep practitioners of Christianity as a result of that history. And I've been presented with the way that they try to reconcile what has happened and their way of going about that spiritual practice. So I want to say that, when that political aim, when that desire for acquisition enters into our spiritual practice, any of us can look around at very personal examples, I'm sure. The corruption is so profound. The twisting of words, the twisting of ideas, the twisting of the heart and soul of the human being becomes very, very difficult and leads to, well, it led to acts of depravity that I don't know if we can even point to memory of similar acts of depravity that like those that took place from that turning and twisting, human being upon human being. So, the impact is indescribable. To tear a people who had found a way of being in harmony with this Mother Earth, to the extent that our science of sustainability is only now being recognized and can hardly even be comprehended, the comprehensiveness of it. So this interruption wasn't only a moral, ethical imposition, but it was the beginning of the destruction of this Mother Earth in its entirety. So I would ask, not only how has this affected me as a human being and my human lineage and community and culture, which has been profound, but how has this affected all the life, all of the life on this Mother Earth? I can't even really say, And so what does this do for us at this time? And I'll wrap up here, is to say, I was told that there were archetypal woundings of humanity, points in our history where there were archetypal woundings of humanity. And And that basically what that means is we were presented with a fork in the road, and I'm going to say a fork in our consciousness, a fork in our heart and soul. And we took the road that is playing out in a domino effect that makes it really hard for us to come back into balance. And I was told that we can retell those stories of when we took that fork in the road. And when we retell that story and we take action on the retelling of that story, that we automatically will change our trajectory into the future. So politically, however this plays out, I'm going to say that movement is profound and can be deeply, deeply impactful for what happens next and how we retell that old story and how the landscape will change into the future. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Pat. I'm going to pass it over to Michelle.
Siguli Sigweg Galuhianuas Neogets Onyo Deakani'i. My name is Michelle Shenandoah, member of the Oneida Nation Wolf Clan of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. My Ungwahua name is Galuhianuas. It means that she's fond of the sky. And that's my connection to our ancestors and that communication. And I just want to say Nyawa to our auntie, Pat McCabe, for those words. Yeah, I just was brought to tears myself. And I can imagine that you felt those words really very deeply. And I'd have to say that that's for so long how so many of our people have been feeling. And I think that we're really very aware of this doctrine, and it's, I'd say it's a lot of the work of our Indigenous peoples that have helped bring to light what those impacts are. And I think it's up to all of us now to begin to discover what that looks like. So in introducing who I am, and my work, I come from matrilineal, matrifocal people of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Oneida Nation. And so my grandmother was the clan mother for our nation. My mom was a faith keeper, and her responsibilities are right within the name of her title of being a faith keeper. And so when I was growing up, the Oneida Nation land claims were really very quite ripe. And they started many generations before my time. I've even just recently heard that my great grandmother was could be considered one of those early people who started with the creating the land back movement. I never met her in my lifetime, but she was somebody who wrote papers to the government, letters to the government for years, knowing that our lands were illegally taken. So this very much inspired me and my work that I came to do, because when I was a young child, I would sit with my grandmother and my mom in meetings for our land claims. And I recognized that this work needed to be carried on. And so I decided I wanted to become a lawyer. And the year that I decided, okay, I finally have to go, I'm not getting any younger, I avoided law school because I just kept thinking it would be so challenging and so hard. And in 2005, the very year that I was taking my LSAT and preparing for law school, the Oneida the Sherrill versus Oneida Nation case was decided. And I didn't realize the impacts of that case at the time, but I did know going into my first year of law school that the land claims case that had been ongoing for generations was closed. That case closed the door on all Oneida land claims and land claims for all Haudenosaunee people within New York State. And despite all the efforts of our people through generations, going into the courts, even being in front of the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote that case, and in 2005 cited what they call latches and laches means you waited too long to bring your claims, and that the expectations of all the settlers have already been established in those lands. And so taking the lands back or not paying taxes on the lands and reclaiming those as Indian lands once again was not fair to the settlers. That's what that case said. And in that case also cited the Doctrine of Discovery. That was the basis for making this decision. It was already settled in the law in 1823 in the Johnson v. McIntosh case that basically gave right for the United States to claim all the lands within its territories based on these papal bulls, right? And based on what was described here by Sister Christian Tomei. Thank you very much for that very nice summary and understanding of those papal bulls. And so this Doctrine of Discovery, I would have never imagined in my life would come to be so personal for me. I see how it has impacted the world, every single person on the world. It's impacted every single life. Just as, our Auntie Pat here has described, it's impacted everything. The water, the air, the blades of grass, the birds, everything is impacted. And I think that that's what we have to recognize. But as human beings, this is the start. How have we treated? How have we been treated? How do we continue to treat? How do we act as humankind? And so we are going to have to take time to look backward, to reflect, to understand, to deepen the understandings, right? So this case, right, I didn't know would come to have so much meaning. This Doctrine of Discovery, I had no idea, none whatsoever. The very first year sitting in law school, a few months after this case had been decided, I read the Johnson v. McIntosh case in law school. It's the very first case every single law student across this country. So every attorney who reads about property law, which is a required course, everybody reads this case first. It's the Johnson v. McIntosh case of 1823. And that's the case that establishes the Doctrine of Discovery in this country. And I'll tell you, I was the only Indigenous student in the classroom. And somehow, as it happens to most Indigenous people, it fell on my shoulders to have to respond to it. Now, this is my first time really hearing about it, even though it had only been cited a few months earlier in the Oneida case. But again, I still didn't fully understand the implications of all of it. So I'm hearing about it for the first time in law school, just like most other law students. And the whole discussion boiled down to who did scalping first? 140 students, most, American citizens. This is what the conversation boiled down to. And I just sat there and watched and observed the whole thing with a sick feeling in my stomach, because I just couldn't overcome, what was already embedded within the consciousness of all these other students that were there. And so we moved on. That's pretty common. So flash forward, right? I established an organization called Repudiation, and it is centered on uplifting the voices of Indigenous women. When we think about land and we think about who a lot of the European, settlers were first dealing with, they were dealing with a lot of matrilineal nations. And who has the say over the land? It's the women. So you can see over hundreds of years, Indigenous women started disappearing and being murdered because they're the ones who had the say over the land. So when you look at this issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, the Doctrine of Discovery is right at the core of it, because it taught European settlers that they can do whatever they wanted with Indigenous peoples. So if the women are in the way, they're the ones that have to be extinguished first, right? Get rid of that voice of authority. So in my work in rematriation, I help to uplift Indigenous women's voices, because we do still have that say over the land. And one of our clan mothers said, we never gave up that right to our lands. It was taken, right? So I flash forward even more, 2022, would have never imagined that I would get a message from one of our clan mothers here in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy asking me if I would go to the Vatican and be part of a delegation that addressed the Pope. And little did I know that I would be addressing the Pope personally. I was the very last person to have closing words with him out of the Indigenous delegations. I went as a female spiritual advisor to balance the counterpart of the male spiritual advisor who was on this trip, who was on these travels. And with that, I brought with me an empty cradle board that we carry our babies in. And I talked all about the Doctrine of Discovery and the importance to rescind this, to revoke it, not just repudiate it, but to pull it forever from the ability to ever be relied upon ever again. And I brought this cradle board and I left it with the Pope overnight. And I told him, I said that this cradle board represents the losses of all the lives of the children who died as a result of the residential schools and the impacts of colonization caused from the Doctrine of Discovery and all of those impacts on all of our families. And I said, I want you to reflect on this overnight. And I said that the way that you treat this cradle board is the way that you will come to treat our people in the future. And the next day, when the Pope issued his apology to all of the delegates that were there, I said, where's the cradle board? The cradle board was not there. And basically, it was returned after the event. And you saw there was the Canadian bishops and cardinals who returned it to me, but they brought it to me after the fact that the event was over, and they were carrying it in a shopping bag and said, hey, come here, and tried to give it back to me. And before they gave it back, I said, hold on. I said, first of all, we have to talk about this Doctrine of Discovery. Yes. We'll have those conversations when we get back to Canada. Okay, so you'll talk to our leaders then? Yes, we'll talk to them. Okay. And then they went to hand me the cradle board and they went to go bless it. And I said, hold on. I said, please understand and respect, we have our ways. You have yours and you have yours. And we have ours, you have yours. Please respect that. And so with that, I took the cradle board back and I said, this is representative of us taking our children back home, reclaiming our children. So for me, this Doctrine of Discovery has been very personal. I stayed on as a cultural consultant last year for the Pope coming to Canada. And, the Indigenous presence that was there. And I did see that the Pope was able to meet with the Prime Minister, the Governor General of Canada, and had a whole room filled with Indigenous chiefs, clan mothers, and never met with them once. Because we're not considered in those eyes as legitimate people or governments. We were just ignored. We were window dressing, and we've been window dressing time after time at all these events. What do you think of when you think of Indigenous peoples? You might think of us dancing, right? Making an appearance or a cultural presentation. But just as, our Auntie Pat here had mentioned about our sciences, well, our governments, our women's rights, it's profound how we've impacted the world. We gave democracy to the United States and to the modern world. We gave women's rights to the United States and to the modern world. and yet still looked at as these uncivilized people. And even the law and the perspectives that have been shaped talk about civilized Indigenous peoples. And that's how most of the world views us to this day. We're still savages in the law, right? There's a lot more to say, but I will now pass it over to our next speaker, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Michelle. Tila, I will invite you to speak next.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm having technical difficulties today, but thank you so much. My name is Tila Troge. I am an attorney from the Shinnecock Nation, and I've been studying the Doctrine of Discovery since I first learned about it in law school. It's the foundational case for American property law, as you heard. But in my instance, I had learned about it the summer before law school. I attended the pre-law summer institute where we had Native law scholars teach us about these things before we encountered them in law school, which kind of helped us get around the barriers that Michelle had faced in describing her story about learning about these principles. And so this case that adopts this doctrine into American jurisprudence is not only the foundational case for federal Indian law, but it's also the foundational case for American property law. And so this is United States Supreme Court's adopting this law, which is now no longer the teaching of the Catholic Church. I mean, for a call to action, we heard a lot about history, but call to action, let's look at every single case that relies on the Marshall Trilogy, on the Johnson case. Let's look at anything that considers that precedential value, and revoke and invalidate that. This case that relies on the Doctrine of Discovery is the foundation for land titles in the United States. And I'm kind of joining this meeting in a crazy way. I just got a stack of like 15 land use violation summons from my local town code enforcement, who also wanted to get me cited by the DEC, which is something that Native people here face a lot, like this, like policing of our use of our land by these entities who are like these state created things created out of like this United States Supreme Court law that uses the Doctrine of Discovery as its basis to make it okay to divest Indigenous people from their land and then use it for themselves to tax and to put on zoning laws and dictate how the land is used. And, you know, the practical impact of what we've seen is that Indigenous people are removed to very unhealthy living situations. The best land is turned in our case, like we're, you know, out on the east end of Long Island, we're surrounded by billionaires and millionaires who have created this fake system of land titles that in its heart is rooted in divesting us from our land because of this doctrine, which if you think about it, it's like the 1500s. Colonization was in the 1600s, so it's a much closer time period. And when we think about now the Doctrine of Discovery, oh, that was, you know, 600 years ago, who cares? Back in the 1640s, like that was still, you know, a lot closer. And it's just so ingrained in our everyday life. Every time that we enter into a real estate transaction, like there's theft and enslavement of the Indigenous people who are still here implicit in that. And the whole foundation of American property law, I mean, it crumbles because it's built on a fallacy, which now has been, you know, repudiated by the Catholic Church. What happens to that foundation? It's not very strong now, but the call to action in my eyes would be to go find every single case that you utilize that as precedent. As you heard, like the second circuit loves to use it, loves to use the doctrine of discovery to the Second Circuit is known as the place where Indian land claims go to die. And they use these laws that are so unfair and so unjust and so wrong, and now like collectively being called back and revoked. So it's time to examine all of those federal laws, but also examine all the state laws that find their precedential value in the Marshall trilogy, in the Johnson case. Like, we can no longer rely on any of those cases, and any cases that have been decided using those cases need to be reviewed and have, you know, their day in court with this new understanding that the doctrine of discovery is not a valid, it's not a valid doctrine that we can build case law around. If we want to really be a equitable and just country, and like, yeah, it's going to be a lot of work, but I think it's the right thing to do to examine our jurisprudence and fix what historical injustices we can, even if it is after the fact. It certainly means that we have our work cut out for us, and there's a lot of education. I didn't find out about the doctrine of discovery until right before law school. Most people probably have never even heard of it. They have no idea that it's the basis for federal Indian law in this country. They don't have no idea it's the basis for property law in this country. Like, they have no clue. You have no clue until you're sitting in your first year of law school and you're in your first property law class and you learn about this. So every attorney knows about it, which means a lot of your lawmakers know about it and a lot of your judges know about it. So that's good, but there's some more education that we have to do for the general public, and that would be another action task. Like, please learn as much as you can about the doctrine of discovery, hold discussion events, or encourage people to attend webinars such as this to learn about what it is and why it was revoked and what impact that will have. Thank you.
Thank you for those calls to action, and yeah, thank you for all of that, Tila. We're going to invite our last speaker, Saka, to join us, and then we'll have just a little bit of time for a question at the end that I'll pose to each of you in reverse order.
My body's very hot. There's a lot moving. So a breath. Thank you to everyone who's spoken before. I really feel that there's not much more for me to say. But I will say a few things because I've been asked to share. Yitol Nishok, Anhike Saka, Iver. I am an Atakpa Ishak and Sea Creole territorial activist, an artist, a researcher, a poet, sovereign poet is how I prefer to articulate it, and a kinmaker. I'm an extremely protective and devoted father of a 4-year-old, and that's important for me to communicate because she rules my life. I currently serve as the Terran Shield and Community Conservation Co-Director with the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust. My work with the Land Trust advances land sovereignty and migrant labor in favor of solidarity with earthly and oceanic care work and Indigenous spiritual agency. I do this by building multi-species congresses in which human and non-human activity consists of labor that will manifest as spoils for today, or rather, spoils for today with plenty. My art and policy work explores the afterlives and aftershocks of colliding cultural land use practices through investigating administrative, legislative, and cultural phenomena. In order to realize a series of protocols for what I deem to be a form of planetary liberation, I've named multi-species jurisprudence, and I published an article recently in the New York University Environmental Law Journal called Sentient Rains. I believe it will be followed in an email to everyone, so you can read that and learn about that. I think it's important for me to share, before I answer the question, how has the Doctrine of Discovery impacted me, that for me, sovereignty is grounded in participation with both the more than human and other than human worlds. The aunties have said it well, Cousin said it very well, like this Doctrine of Discovery impacts everything. And everything currently on earth has been sliced in horrendous ways by the presentation and imposition of Christian personhood, which has laid the foundations and grounds for white supremacy as we know it. I believe that the acts of welcoming in and returning to and bonding with or bonding through each speak to different moments in the development of a relationship with a fully sentient territory that is our planet Earth. I'm devoted to the work of meeting the need for holding and the defense of a place where an everyday conscious building citizen, I believe that would be all of you here, can procure for constructive civil unrest tools and mending. I've committed my art practice, as I said, to the development of several projects to this end. Currently, I'm working on the development of alternative land holding entity called a sovereign ecosystem trust, which I hope to be a step towards property abolition, the eradication of private property ownership, and a step away from policing land use by Indigenous persons seeking to adapt and contribute resilience in their territories. I'm also developing a fellowship called the Soul of Stewardship Fellowship, which seeks to train fellows to provide ceremonial intervention at the site of land transaction and service of materializing agreements and practices that deposition humans from dominating the center of the ecological. How has the DoD impacted me? I don't think I would exist if the DoD hadn't been what it is. I am culturally a Takapa Ishak. I am politically Black. I am what I would consider, perhaps in the mythology, a new world chimera. I believe, as Fred Moten, the scholar and poet, says, that Blackness has the ability to end the world as we know it, and this world currently is one that needs to end. And I believe that in darkness is where we find the Creator, and we know that when we put our hands in the soil or when we dive deep. The fullest expression of repudiation would be not a performative utterance. I repudiate. It would be an absolute mobilization of what resources are had to return the land to those from whom you took it. It would be a advocacy, again, sorry, it's very heated. It would be an advocacy, an administrative intervention, and all of those cities, governing systems that have developed and built themselves upon this extractive philosophy. It would be a welcoming and a redistribution of wealth and resource. That's really it. The repudiation is, for me, meaningless, and it is quite offensive to me that it starts and centers, that it starts with the statement, infidelity to the mandate received from Christ. The Catholic Church strives to promote universal fraternity and respect for the dignity of every human being, because I am not human as the West or the Catholic Church would have me understand it. I'm Ishak, and my relationships with all around me is what makes me who I am. And when you exclude the rest of what makes me who I am, you are not seeing, recognizing me, and I don't think that we can treat together.
Thank you, Saka. You actually also, I think, are going to, you got us started with our next question, which is, what would true repudiation or the fullest expression look like for you? And what impact would that have on the work or your community or the dreams you carry? And unfortunately, because of time, we're gonna request that our 4 panelists speak to that in maybe more of a haiku form, 1 minute or so. So if you have your answer ready. Saka, you already spoke to that, so I don't know if you want to say anything else, or if you just want to move on to Michelle, perhaps, or sorry, Tila. Okay, we'll bring Tila back on then. Or perhaps Michelle, I don't know if Tila is,
Go ahead and do Michelle. I think Tila's got to get her video going.
okay, great.
Okay. So just very briefly, what I really think about is, we're in a place and time of restorative justice. And in order to come to that place, you have to make it right. And you have to make it right with those who have been harmed. They need to be restored to wellness, to balance. And, this is genocide. This is not just about land. We're talking about, the Doctrine of Discovery being codified law. Law shapes policy, policy shapes education, education shapes how people come to treat one another. And the world has been okay with committing genocide against Indigenous and Black peoples without seeing it. And now it's time to open your eyes, to open your heart, and to ask the questions, how can you make this right? How can we make this right? And we do have to all work together, because our Mother Earth is asking us to work together at this time. But it does need to be made right with the Indigenous peoples within North America, within the United States. And so I think about that restorative justice, and not just with Indigenous peoples, but with Indigenous and Black peoples and Brown peoples throughout, the Americas. And so restorative justice, restoring to wellness and to harmony. And it's not until the grandmothers, the women of our nations, can say, okay, we feel good now, that question is fully answered.
Thank you, Michelle. Tila, if your video's on, we invite you.
I just really think that the answer is land back and returning as much access and stewardship to Indigenous people to the land is critical in starting the healing process. And yeah, the work is here for us to do, and we just got to get working. And thank you to everyone who took time to learn about this, and we can all be part of the solution for this one, and use our voices to call for justice.
Thank you, Tila. Pat,
Thank you. It's a fair question, and it's a question that I really can't even answer. Because I know we're so far away from it, that toxicity has been so deeply embedded into human consciousness over generations that myself, I don't even feel to be able to answer that question. But those who spoke before me have definitely answered it in the way that I would. So what I will say instead is, because I don't want to push any possibilities further away, like that's how deep it is. And we need these possibilities to be brought into our hearts and actions. So what I will say is, one, something I've been saying for a while, which is that if we believe that every single law on the planet has to be fulfilled, every single legal contractual agreement has to be fulfilled, we're going to lose this earth, because there's not enough earth to fulfill all of those agreements. So what does that say? That says that on all sides, even though that legal holding is sacrosanct, it's time to be able to come together relationally. It's time to be able to come together through what is moving through our hearts and spirits, and take actions that are outside of those constructs. We're just gonna, we have to do it. We have to do it. I want to say that, if I go back to this teaching, I've been in a study of reimagining money and protecting the sacred, and one of our elders there has said something along the lines of, well, money is already everywhere. And so if we were to change our consciousness and our agreements around it, it could actually end up being a currency for change in a direction that we would like to see. And so I'm going to equate that to Christianity. Christianity has been overlaid upon this earth and upon human consciousness, even for those who don't claim it as a faith. there's always even a holding it out that's present to even to carry on with a different spiritual way of life. And so this is a moment where the principles, the teaching of the Christ can actually be enacted, can actually be invoked and practiced in all the places that Christianity has found itself and imposed itself, and has rested on its own law and interpretation. So this is the call that I make. And I'm going to also say, as you know, when previous speaker, sorry, I'm drawing a blank on your name all of a sudden, but when she said, you know, when the grandmothers are satisfied, that's how we'll know. You know, I'm going to say that there is work on all sides spiritually at this time to ask this Mother Earth, to ask all the rest of the life. We shouldn't be the ones to say and make the decisions of open receiving of every and any answer, or being harsh and saying, no, you haven't met this. We're speaking on behalf of all life when we do that. So we all have some spiritual inquiry to make about what is really called for in this moment, on every side, in every culture, in every practice. So that's something that I would call for at this time.
Thank you, Pat. And thank you to all of our speakers. This has been a full hour, and we're with you in witnessing, and yeah, are grateful for your words and your work and being in the world. We're going to spend just a few last minutes before the end of the hour talking about next steps. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Brittany.
Thank you. Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Tila. Thank you, Saka. And thank you to all who have come to bring your attention to this conversation. Pat, you have said it. This is a moment to make choices outside of this paradigm. And I want to speak for a moment about, what does this mean? How do we actually bring to life what the repudiation could mean in the decisions that we make? And I'm addressing right now specifically, if you are a landowner in this current paradigm, if you are a religious landowner, this is the work of the Land Justice Project, and this is a moment where we can choose collectively. Is this when real change starts to happen? When a repudiation is brought to life by real actions of repair? I think that moment could be possible, but it depends on our choosing to ask the question. As we are, as religious communities everywhere, and members of the Catholic Church, the largest private landowner in the world, directly related to the doctrine we've been talking about for an hour. As churches are letting go of property, as religious communities are deciding the future of their lands, how can we ask that question centering the transformative healing and acts of repair that are needed? That is a question that is our responsibility to ask. And I really believe that if we ask that question, we can uncover a different future together. This is where the rubber hits the road. The decisions that we make about land that was unjustly inherited for the future of everyone and all life, for the healing of the people that have been most harmed by this paradigm, we have the power to do that. And we don't have all the answers as the Land Justice Project, but we believe that this is the time to ask the question together and to create together, to imagine outside of this paradigm. So if you are wanting to join us in that question, in this community of practice, we are putting together at the end of the month an introduction to land justice and transforming land legacies. As a community, we are studying what are examples of cracks, dents in the armor of this paradigm in how we make choices about land. And our learning platform has a lot of examples. Many of our speakers have spoken to examples of how land can be returned and relationship to land can be returned, and land can be protected and regenerated. So we're going to talk about what this can really mean for you and what action can look like on April 27th from 12 to 1:30 Eastern, and we would love to have you there. And if you've been in our community for a while, this might be a review, but it's a review worth doing. And and I'll just point out too, our learning platform is here. A link will be in the chat, and we have many other offerings coming up, including next Wednesday. If you are already kind of down the road of trying to build relationships with Indigenous folks, Black folks, bringing restoring relationship to land, this is a 3-hour training with our friends at the Center for Ethical Land Transition about how to really center healing and solidarity and relationship in that, to really show up in a way that is going to support, is going to center the needs of Black and Indigenous people and people of color. So please join us. It is a beautiful community, and we are really, I believe that this moment is a powerful moment of choice, and we're going to make that choice if we do it together. It's easier together, and it's a community worth being in. I know Brenna has one extra call to action that we want to uplift as well, so I will pass it to her.
Thank you, Brittany, and thank you again, all of our speakers. As some of you mentioned already, the worldview that undergirded this same worldview of Christian supremacy that undergirded the doctrine of discovery is the same worldview that led to Catholics and other Christian denominations enthusiastically embracing the government's Indian boarding school policy, which had the explicit goal of assimilating Indigenous children into the white Western Christian way of life, and an also explicit goal of stealing more land. And as we know, this policy had disastrous consequences that are still with us today. So if I know a lot of people who are listening today are members of religious communities or dioceses or other Christian denominations who ran Native boarding schools, make sure you please take the appropriate steps to make the archives that your community or diocese or denomination likely holds. That's a specific request that's been made. There are many more steps for healing, but one specific thing we could do as one first small step is make those archives available in an appropriate way. So there's a link in the chat to a brief resource guide for learning a little bit more about how archives can be instrumental in the truth and healing process and steps you can take to make those available, practical steps. There's also some great webinars learning more about the impact of boarding schools and the role that archives can play in the truth and healing process. So thank you.
You, Brenna and Brittany. We hope you'll join us in some of those action steps. We'll be bringing you more resources as well as some other calls to action. There are Indigenous land defense struggles happening right now that we can also uplift and want to call your attention to. But with that, maybe if we can all just take a moment together and look at the faces on this screen and send love to our 4 speakers, Saka, Tila, Michelle, Pat. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's such an honor, and we're with you. We're with you. As we say goodbye, if you wanted to come off mute, we can just end with a cacophony of goodbyes. This is a community after all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Bye,
much.
thank you.
Thank you. Looking forward to the record.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Blessed Easter to all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Blessings.